This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Remember, we have a merchandise store on TeePublic. You can get all of your Graceful Atheist and Secular Grace-themed items there. The link will be in the show notes. If you're in the middle of doubt, deconstruction, the dark night of the soul, you do not have to do it alone. Join our private Facebook group, Deconversion Anonymous, and become a part of the community. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/deconversion. I want to take a moment to celebrate. This is the 200th episode of the Graceful Atheist Podcast. A huge shout out to Mike T for all the editing work over the years. And a huge shout out to Arlene, who has single-handedly carried the podcast over the last couple of months. I'll talk a little bit more in the final thoughts section about where the podcast goes from here, but celebrate with me that we have gotten to this huge mile marker. On to today's show. My returning guest today is Matthew Taylor. Matthew was on the show in 2019. Matthew is the co-host of the Still Unbelievable podcast. He and his colleagues, Andrew and David, originally wrote a book in response to Justin Brierley's Unbelievable book, and both the book and the podcast are kind of a response to that. Matthew's been a good friend over the years, and I was really glad to have him back here for the 200th episode. And today we discuss why we podcast, what it is that drives us to do what we do, and what we hope that the community gets out of it. Here's my conversation with Matthew Taylor. Matthew Taylor, welcome back to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Hello, David. Fabulous to chat again with you. It really is. It's been a while. We've just been talking off mic about that. It's great to see each other again as well, and not just hear the voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to set some context for everyone else, you are the co-host of Still Unbelievable, podcast that is in many ways a response to Justin Brierley's Unbelievable podcast. You've written a book on that same subject. You've done a bunch of things. I'd like to hear just from your words, some of the projects that you've been involved in.
Yes, quite a few. So the whole thing all started with Still Unbelievable, the book, which came out a year after Justin Brierley's Unbelievable book came out. I mean, that's not where my story starts, but that's where this story starts.
Right.
And so that came in. I jumped on board with that project, made some great friends as part of that project. And out of that project was born the podcast Still Unbelievable, which I'm now host of. We've, in the last few months, passed through 100 episodes, which is great, but it's 100 episodes in about 4, almost 5 years. So we're not as regular as other podcasts, which we could mention, David. So that came out, and we did try a couple of podcasts. Andrew and I did also do the Ask an Atheist podcast for a while, and we merged into that, but it rapidly became very obvious that we were trying to juggle similar content on 2 different feeds, and it made no sense whatsoever. And so right. Ask an Atheist Anything in the Proscenium feed, which it merged into, just quietly got dropped because it just made no sense to carry on with that. I'm very happy with the decision that we made. We weren't going to let go of the Still Unbelievable name because we like the brand Still Unbelievable. We like that it's a throwback to Justin Brierley's Unbelievable podcast, which anybody who talks in this space knows about. So we feel that it was a good thing to keep onto that brand. And that brand has got us onto the radar of a couple of publishing houses. So it means that we do occasionally get an email from a publishing house saying, here is a book that we think you guys might like, right. Which is a wonderful place to be. We've had this past year, 2023, Andrew and I have featured 3 authors on Still Unbelievable. Each one of those was a fabulous conversation, a conversation which I appreciated. I learnt lots from each of those conversations. I'm really glad to be able to feature those kinds of people. And I don't pay for a book, which for me is a double win.
That's right.
So I'm putting a lot of effort into Still Unbelievable, but we're not really a network, but we're part of a community of podcasts. You are obviously one of them. David, who was part of the Still Unbelievable book project over on Skeptics and Seekers, we feature him, and we're very tightly involved with him because Andrew and David, Andrew, my co-host on Still Unbelievable, for those who don't listen. So we are talking regularly and featuring each other regularly. Then there's Clint Haycock, an ex-American pastor here in the UK, on the Mindshift podcast. I really like Clint. I really like the way he thinks. I really like the way he produces his podcast. So I've been on that a while. But yours and his podcast were both right at the early days when I was featured on them, in the early days of lockdown. In fact, we didn't even know what COVID was when I was on your podcast. So the world has changed, and it's changed.
That's true. Yeah.
And what I've liked about that interim period is there's been an explosion of really good community groups, lots of Facebook groups all around the kind of space that we talk in. People helping each other, some UK-centric ones, which is beautiful to see as well, because and no one can tell from my accent, I am based in the UK. And it's really good to see those. So I've joined quite a few of those, and I'm not very active on them because I am literally so busy. But it is really nice to see the communities building there and people helping people. And it's great to see that. And
absolutely.
I like to think that these voices that are verbal on all these podcasts are helping to facilitate that, because when I was deconstructing, podcasts weren't a thing, it was blogs. And I found a small blogging community when I was doing my deconstruction. And those guys really helped me, being able to blog through some of my thoughts and to be able to read other people's thoughts and us comment on each other's posts and help each other and support each other. I loved that community. And those people, I know I've moved out of that community. I'm now into podcasting, but I still look back fondly on those times because I needed people. I needed people who understood me. I needed people who understood my fears in a visceral way, which nobody I knew with skin could comprehend. And those people at the other end of that keyboard, those people at the other end of those monitor screens, I didn't need to hear their voice. I didn't need to see their faces. I just needed to read their words, and their words were full of compassion. Their words were full of love. Their words were full of understanding. And I needed those people while I was going through that process. And technology has allowed much more dynamic ways of providing that. And I love the podcasting community that is doing that, all the various podcasts that have sprung up talking around that. And I love all the various Facebook groups, which provide some really, really good support to people. And it's wonderful to see that happen.
So both of us have gone back and listened to your first episode on this podcast, and that was in 2019. And a couple things that just struck me about it. One is, you can hear, I think both of us, but me in particular, trying to figure out what is it that we do here. And the other is just what you just said, that, we weren't interested in bashing Christians. What we were interested in is finding community for people who were having doubts, deconstructing, deconverting, what have you. And you in particular were expressing that compassion for people going through that process.
Yes, I was quite surprised actually how much that came across in the episode that recorded, because I do need to give a health warning. Still Unbelievable can be a difficult place to be for people who are still sympathetic towards Christianity. I make no excuses for that. I self-describe as spiky.
Yes.
Graceful doesn't apply to me. I'm glad that you do what you do because I couldn't.
Right.
And so we are very different in that way. But our end goal and our desires for those who are in the place that we were both in, however many years ago it was, is necessary. And I do occasionally get emails from people saying that Still Unbelievable has helped them because it's helped them to frame their thinking. And that's what I try to offer with Still Unbelievable. I critique Christianity in very particular ways in some of our episodes. And I think that's helped to frame some people in terms of how they think about Christianity and how they think about their experiences and how to frame the doubts that they are experiencing and how to put words and logic and even science to some of those doubts. So just to put a little bit of a a caveat. Yes, I am for supporting the deconstructor, but there will be some spikiness on Still Unbelievable.
Sure.
So be aware of that. I don't try to be a friendly place for Christians.
Understood. And I think you also expressed the support for truth. And I think you said it by saying you wanted to stand up against inaccuracy,
Yes,
wherever
yes.
that was. So I think both of those themes came across in your earlier
yes.
interview.
Although having said that, I do try to treat my Christian guests as well as I possibly can. And some of the authors that we featured are Christian guests. And I don't know when this episode is going to go live, David, but a nice spoiler for you. And in case this comes out before January next year, I have got in the can an episode which I'm partway through recording where Andrew and I have interviewed a pastor in the US who's written a book on hell. And the book is called Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation. And the pastor who's written this book is a universalist, and he gives a very strong case for universalism and for a loving God not being a God of eternal damnation, a loving God not being a God of eternal torment, a loving God being a God where everybody is brought to himself. And he produces what I think is a very powerful case for that. And we have a delightful conversation. For the first time in my life, I've uttered the words, I enjoyed reading a book about hell. And I never thought that I would ever say that. But that is how I feel about this book. And I do know from what I've read in some of the various forums, hell is a problem. Hell is a problem for people in our position. Hell creates significant issues for people who are deconstructing. And I genuinely recommend this book. I don't care where you are on the deconversion spectrum, whether you intend to deconvert or not, whether you just want to deconstruct something and retain a faith, or whether you are completely anti-Christianity completely. If you're at all interested in the subject of hell, I genuinely recommend this book. It's called Holy Hell, A Case Against Eternal Damnation. It will be coming out in February next year, 2024. Our episode with the author will come out at some point in January, the tail end of January next year. Highly recommend it. It's going to be a beautiful episode. We enjoyed the conversation. And there are Christians out there who are fighting for us, fighting for a loving experience of that kind of conversation.
I actually want to ask you about your experience going on to Justin Brierley's podcast. So again, all of this work that you've done that was a bit in response to his work. And then you were on his podcast, which for anybody who might not know,
yes.
For the three people who don't, this is probably one of the biggest, definitely focused on apologetics, Christian podcasts in the world. And so this was kind of a big deal.
Absolutely. If somebody like me is going to be on any Christian podcast, Unbelievable is the one they're going to be. Although I should point out that within a few weeks of Justin then being on my show, because he was on my show immediately after me being on his, he then announced that he was leaving Unbelievable. I mean, maybe it's a coincidence, but I'm definitely going to milk that as much as I possibly can. Yes. But yes, so Justin been doing that over 17 years. He'd been doing that. So I've now got a target for Still Unbelievable. That's yes. The target that I'm aiming for Still Unbelievable. Andrew and I are not going anywhere, so hang around. So I genuinely didn't think I would ever get onto Unbelievable. I had been a regular listener for a very long time, and I had written Justin on numerous times. And then out of the blue, I got an email with the book linked into it. I was copied in with a couple of other people, and Justin said to these people, I've got an author here. Here's a book. We need a layperson to have a conversation with him. Is anybody up for it? And I went, yes.
Yeah.
So I had a chat with Mike DeVigilio and his book. What was it called? Uninvented. His hypothesis is the stories in the Bible read in such a way that they couldn't possibly be invented. I don't know how to describe that premise without breaking any kind of swear filters. Because
you're fine. You can express yourself.
It's bullshit. Frankly, it really is. It's utter bullshit. And to quote David from Skeptics and Seekers, who is an ex-pastor, and he is a vociferous reader. He said to me offline afterwards, he says he's read a lot of Christian books, and that one was by a long way the worst one that he'd ever read.
Yeah.
So that was quite something coming from David. So I read this book and I think chapter 2, he talks about something in the Dead Sea Scrolls. He makes a very specific claim about the quality of the texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm like, great, something I can fact check, because that's one thing I like to do. I fact check, and anybody who listens to Still Unbelievable, you should know that my show notes are always full of links from anything that is fact checkable in any episode that goes out. There'll be a link to it if I can find it in the show notes. So always check the show notes if you're listening to Still Unbelievable, because they'll be jam-packed full of notes and links and references to things that are mentioned in the episode. So anyway, so I went along and I tried to fact check this claim that he made about the Dead Sea Scrolls and the accuracy is it, and it was rubbish. His claim was falsified. The first thing I found out about the Dead Sea Scrolls is the book. I think he mentioned specifically the book of Isaiah. If it wasn't Isaiah, it was one of the prophet books. And the information that I found out about this book in Dead Sea Scrolls, that most people think it actually has two authors. Two different people have written it, and there's evidence of copying between the two. And in the various copies that were found in those caves, there are differences. So this entire claim that he'd made was completely falsified by literally 10 minutes of Google searching. I didn't need to go deep. It was there really quickly. And I brought this up on that episode, and it was just roundly ignored, and he didn't even try to defend it, and he moved on. And that was deeply frustrating. And the book was like that all the way through. There was everything that I could fact check was difficult. It basically failed. And most of it was based on what he called verisimilitude, which was, it sounds like it's too good to be true, therefore it must be too good to be true. It really is such a weak thing on which to base any kind of case on that. And so my concern going on to Unbelievable was I going to be able to keep my cool? I was genuinely concerned that I would just lose it and go off on a rant. And if I'm going to go on to anything high profile, that is the last thing that I need to do.
Yeah.
But I managed it. I managed to get through. And Justin did say to me afterwards, he thought I did fairly well. And I got some really positive feedback from people. Still Unbelievable got a noticeable jump in the listeners following that going out. So thank you to anybody who's listening to this and listened to that and joined Still Unbelievable. I really did appreciate the positive comments. But yeah, I'd have liked to have had a better quality conversation, if I'm really honest. But it was quite an experience doing that on Justin's show, on doing something so big.
This is actually a topic that I want to explore just for a minute. I think in the early days of this podcast, I thought, oh, I want to talk to more Christians. And in my mind, I thought of apologists. And for those of my listeners who don't pay attention to apologetics, my apologies, but that's what we are going to look at here. And I found the same thing. It didn't matter really who it was. I've interviewed probably, 3, 4 apologists, like professional apologists. And my experience was that you bring up a point that, is kind of a fact, and they just walk around it, right?
Yeah.
There was never the direct addressing of the point that you were making. And the better the apologist, the less they actually address the point that you're making. So I'm wondering, after so many years of doing the podcast and talking to various different Christian authors, apologists, that kind of thing, has that changed for you at all? Like how you approach a conversation like that?
Possibly. I'm less forgiving of bad arguments. I've noticed that over the years. I've definitely, and because I've seen so many bad ones. And when I first started interacting, I definitely took the attitude of, I don't want to sell the typical stereotype of the angry atheist. I want to be thoughtful and I want to be considerate. And because I understand Christianity, I want to at least show to the Christian a Christian attitude. But I've had so many bad responses in that kind of space that I lose patience for that, and I'm not so keen and not so quick to go for the softly approach now, because I've tried it so many times where I've tried to gently feed and say, no, that's not quite that. You didn't answer my question, and just try and rephrase it in a nice way, etc. And like you've just said, there's just no appetite to actually address it directly. So I've given up playing nice around that and just go straight forward and call it out. I'm wasting everybody's time if I do that. Let's go back to Justin, because after I was on Unbelievable and then Justin came on to us, and we talked a little bit around, because one of Justin's narratives, and I think it comes out in the new book that he's written. I've not read it yet. It was on my project list for 2024. His new book. He tries to push this thing about Christianity being a global good, being the source of all the great things that we have in society. And Andrew and I pushed him back on that, and we pushed him back quite firmly, and he just wouldn't budge. It was really, that conversation was really frustrating for Andrew and myself, and we ended up just moving on. And I had feedback after that episode from several people saying that they really didn't appreciate how hard Justin pushed on the Christianity has been a global good in these areas. And that particular subject is probably the biggest single subject that Andrew and I have had direct feedback on to an episode. People really did not appreciate the way that he was pushing that narrative. Too many people saw straight through it, didn't like it. And so, because Justin was a big name and Andrew and I both wanted to be polite, we didn't push it as hard as we could have. And I think if I was to repeat it, I'd probably be ruder, purely because I think this point needs to be made very strongly. And I think there's a danger. It's a balance, David. It genuinely is a balance in how we respond to prominent Christians, because there's this Christian narrative of, oh, they're an atheist, they're going to be rude. And if they're going to be rude and angry, it's because they're a bitter atheist. Now I can write off everything they say. So we're under pressure to be on good behavior, because the second we let that slip, oh, it's just their atheism going through, now you see their true colors. Whereas a Christian is actually granted space to lose it. They're actually given grace if they lose it. And there's this disparity there in expectation and judgment of behavior. And I'm getting a little bit tired of that. So some of the episodes I've done on Still Unbelievable, they've been solo episodes where I've reviewed a Christian podcast, and I just go for it on those episodes. I ramp up the sarcasm. I'll put in appropriate sound effects for things now, and I'll raise my voice, and I'll really hit it, because I think people need to hear an emotional response sometimes to these. I don't think it works all the time to have this calm thing. So I think if I was to have that again, and if I ever manage to tempt Justin, don't listen to this. If I ever tempt Justin back onto Still Unbelievable again, I think I'll be less calm, and I think I'll push back a lot harder, because I think these narratives need to be pushed back more. Maybe we're going to get a new dawn of the new atheist and that kind of polemic. That's me. Does that give you the answer you were expecting?
No, I think that's a good answer. I think where I landed was about consistency.
Oh, I'm not consistent. You're consistently graceful. I couldn't hold it up, which is why I need these other episodes to let off some steam.
Yeah. No, what I mean is when I'm interacting with particularly an apologist, right? For example, your author makes the argument about verisimilitude. It sounds too good to be true, so it must be. To that, I would respond, so the Muslim says that it's a miracle that the Quran exists, right? So that is the exact same argument.
It is.
And so to be consistent, both of those things would have to be true. So are they both true, or are you using a bad argument? And I don't think that changes their mind at all. I still think they just go around it. But for me, the way that I communicate it these days is to say, I need to be consistent. And so if you are going to lower the bar of evidence required for something, that lowers it everywhere, not just for your particular religious claim.
Yes.
So part of what we wanted to talk about here is why we podcast.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to hear first, we've talked about it a little bit, but why you started, why you and Andrew began this process, and then maybe a little bit about why you continue to do this.
Yes, then there's some good points to be made there. So as I mentioned when I was first on, it wasn't on my radar to podcast. And then Andrew and David, off the back of Still Unbelievable, the book, thought, well, this brand, this momentum needs to continue. And they were right. So, and podcasting is taking off. There's a deconstruction space that needs voices. Let's do it. So we started a small number of podcasts, Ask an Atheist Anything we've talked about, which has gone by the wayside, although the episodes, I believe, are still available. There are some interesting episodes there if people want to look that up and listen to them. I will be gradually going through the back catalogue of that and picking off some of the best ones and rebroadcasting them onto Still Unbelievable, because we've got new listeners who might appreciate them.
Yeah.
So, but it was never on my radar to do it. And then probably David, bless him. Everything's David's fault over at Skeptics and Seekers. if it seems that everybody I know called David is responsible for something happening in my life.
Yeah.
And so David said,
and this is David of
this
Skeptics
David
and
on
Seekers.
Skeptics and Seekers. Yes, David Johnson over on Skeptics and Seekers. And he's a guy I respect immensely. He helped me find my writing voice. He's complimented me immensely on my own writing. And he said, Matthew, I think you'll have a good voice for podcasting, plus English accent. What's to lose? And genuinely, I've loved it. Andrew and I started, it was a little bit of a shaky start. I daren't listen to some of our first couple of episodes. I'm sure I would shiver in embarrassment. But we got it going. We managed to capture a couple of interesting guests. Yeah, so gradually momentum carried on, and then we started getting some really interesting guests, people I really enjoyed speaking to. I think my first high profile one was John Steingard. I stalked him after he was on Unbelievable. It took me a couple of months to find him. I eventually managed to find him on Instagram, I think, and sent him a message, and he responded very positively. We had a joyful conversation with John Steingard, and I believe you had a conversation with John Steingard as well.
Yeah.
Fabulous individual. And suddenly you say I'm a podcaster, it suddenly starts to open doors. And I've managed to reach out, and I reached out to Joshua Somadas, who's a Christian apologist, who's written a book called The Genealogical Adam and Eve. Interesting scientifically. I'm not entirely sure some of the things he says are safe in terms of the conclusions he's come to. But definitely, if you're that way inclined, it's potentially an interesting book. There's lots of references, very technical. Enjoyed the conversation there. And I've really enjoyed those kinds of conversations. And conversations are where it's at, really. Having good quality conversations, because you can show to each other when you're doing it across the table, having a conversation which is productive and friendly, which I've managed to have, despite what I've said about Spiky and all that, helps to see the other person as a human. And that helps the conversation. And I think humanizing the opponent, having an actual conversation with them, not a text-based conversation, but an actual conversation, has done wonders for my attitude towards Christian individuals. And I hope has done the same the other direction, because those kinds of things I've enjoyed the most. And like I say, Erdmann's, the publisher, have contacted me twice now with a Christian author, and we've had that conversation. The second one is the one I just told you about the hell. If people don't see value in some of those conversations, they're not going to reach out and say, here's a book I think you should read. Here's an author I think you'd enjoy a conversation with. That must surely be a risk for somebody to push a Christian author onto a podcast like Still Unbelievable and say, I think this is a conversation you'll like. Because the gamble that they're taking is Andrew and I as atheists will A, pan the book, and then B, continue to pan the book, and then C, pan it with extra venom, and then D, continue to talk about it for the rest of the year about how awful that bloody book was. That's the risk that they take. And both times that I've had that contact, I've had a fabulous experience reading the book and a fabulous conversation. So I think it pays dividends to actually reach out. And I've reached out. I reached out to Joshua Somadas. I've reached out to Steve Chalk, who's a big name in the UK. People outside the UK might not be familiar with the name, but certainly people from the Christian tradition in the UK will know the name Steve Chalk. Fabulous conversation. Sometimes it's worth making that reach out to somebody. You never know who you'll catch. And I think humanizing other people and having those lovely, pleasant conversations actually is better than being spiky, really, honestly, when it gets down to the bottom of it. It's worth it. And also, I think the reason why it's worth having those conversations across the aisle like that is lookers on, regardless of where they are, whether they're transitioning from one side to the other, or whether they're just hovering in the mucky ground in the middle, will probably appreciate those conversations as well. And it'll probably just help them to focus some of the thinking that they have. So spiky people as well, let's aim for the pleasant conversations, because I get so much more out of those pleasant conversations. I mentioned earlier about sometimes I do those really snarky episodes. I actually get more pleasure. I got a lot more pleasure out of that conversation that I've just told you about with Derek about his Holy Hell book. I got so much more pleasure out of that than I do out of 3 episodes where I rip apart a Christian podcast talking about stuff I don't like.
What do you get out of it? So you've basically been saying that, these conversations I think are meaningful for you. Is that part of why you continue to podcast?
Yes, definitely it is. And I've one of the big question marks over the whole deconstruction experience is purpose and meaning. I grew up in a Christian condition where I was taught from a very young age and well into adulthood, God has a purpose for you. God has a plan for you. Part of what you need to do is find out what God wants you to do in your life. And one of the things that I experienced as a young 20-year-old was, you're going to chuckle at this, I promise you. I was at a big evangelical meeting, and it was a weekend, and there was teaching and seminars and stuff like that. And at one of these big meetings, somebody came and says, "I've got a prophet here with Ines, and he's going to look around the room, and then at one point he's going to walk around the room, and he's going to see if God's telling him about any of the people there." So we did this, and this guy did this, walked this around the room, and then they came back and a couple of words, etc., etc. And then the next thing I know, I was in the back row of this meeting. Literally, I got singled out from the front, and he pointed me out, and I said, "What mean?" I pointed the person next to me. He said, "No, you, sir." And he said, "Yeah, that guy there, he's going to have an apostolic ministry." And of course, my knees buckled under me. I sat down. This was an emotional thing that I simply struggled to cope with. And that weighed on my mind for quite some time. And I was given some words of wisdom and advice about that, because being singled out to be an apostle is quite a big thing. This wasn't just somebody who had a good teaching ministry or somebody who was going to bless people. This is somebody who was going to have an apostolic ministry. It was a big thing. So that weighed on me for years. And so how do I fulfill this prophecy? And when you come from a Christian tradition where, part of what you're supposed to be doing is looking for what God wants for you, looking for God's purpose in your life, that creates an awful lot of stress. And I've seen people struggle with that very idea. How do I know if this thing that I'm doing is part of God's purpose in life? How do I know if buying this house is part of God's purpose for my life? How do I know if marrying this person is part of God's purpose for my life? I don't feel like I've got a purpose in my life. And here I am just merrily having a family and going to church. Shouldn't I be doing something really great? And I've seen so many people hurt by this very idea. And then, of course, when you deconstruct and you leave Christianity, this question doesn't go away. You go, okay, now what do I do about purpose? Because it's now embedded into your life after decades of teaching that you need to find a purpose for your life. Your life has a purpose. You just need to find it. It's this whole thing, sit on a mat and look to the dawn. And why not just do what you love? If something gives you pleasure, do it. and enjoy it. And if you enjoy it, it will be purposeful.
Yeah.
And make it as simple as that. And that took some unlearning for me. And podcasting, this conversation that having you is actually energizing me, David. I'm loving it. I'm really enjoying it. And when I have conversations like this on Still Unbelievable, it energizes me. And sometimes I can come away from the microphone, it can be 10:30 at night, and I'll be buzzing. And I have to go and grab a hot chocolate, do my old man thing, sit in bed, put on a crime drama and watch something, because I need an hour to wind down. And then I get up at 6:00 the next morning to go and do a day's work.
I would definitely say that it's very similar for me. And I was more explicit about this in the early days, that I was doing it selfishly. I needed to be able to talk to people about what I was going through as well. And then this podcast fell into, more of the deconversion stories as the main theme. And that in those early days was just still very important for me to be able to talk about what I was going through as well. And I felt like I got more out of it than the people I was interviewing.
Yes. And I like it when we have an episode like that. And I like getting feedback, underneath, sometimes we have a little ego there that needs a little scratch. So guys, send feedback, do reviews on Amazon and Spotify and iTunes, do all that kind of thing, because it genuinely scratches us and it helps us produce content that you guys like listening to. So please, reviews. Let's do it. It's really great. I love having feedback. It's really good to have had feedback from people in various scenarios. And it's even more strange to occasionally get feedback from a Christian saying, can I have a conversation with you guys? Having an email like that just kind of, does he listen to my back catalogue? Does he know the kind of atheist I am?
Yes. Yeah.
And so that's why I continue to do it, because I find that it motivates me. And, I am a busy guy. I do work more than my contracted hours because I'm in a very busy job. And on top of doing this, I do community theatre as well. And for anybody who knows what it's like to do amateur dramatics, when it comes up to doing a show, you end up with a very, very busy couple of weeks with rehearsals and technical call rehearsals and dress rehearsals. And then show week comes along and you literally don't sleep the entire week.
Yeah.
It's hard and it wipes me out. And I do 2 shows a year, sometimes 3 or 4 shows a year, and that can completely wipe me out. This year I wasn't quite in 2 shows. I was doing front of house for 1 show, which is a busy job in itself, talking to the community, making sure everybody's got their seats, making sure everybody's got their tickets and all this kind of thing, sorting out any issues that come up and that kind of thing. It's a very different role, very busy role, very stressful role. And then 2 weeks after that, I was in a show. So it can get very, very busy doing that kind of thing. And I'm doing that while also trying to schedule guests for a podcast, while also doing a full-time job. And then, as you've heard a couple of times, I'm still trying to recover from a cold that I had when I was on play. And when you get over that magical 50, sore throats hang around for a ridiculously long period of time. And it's really, really frustrating.
We've talked a bit about how it affects us. I'm curious how you think our podcasting in general in the secular world affects the community. And just as a bit of context, when I started, I was responding to, there were lots of angry atheists. There were lots of mostly debate, mostly hostile interactions. And I was interested in having human conversations, more person to person, again, as to use your words, respecting the other person's humanity. And that felt new at that moment.
Yeah.
And in between then and now, the whole deconstruction movement took place, right? Mm-hmm. We were kind of the tail end of the atheist kind of movement and then became this deconstruction movement, as it were. And so I'm just curious how you think your podcast, what you and Andrew were doing and are doing, has had an impact on that community.
Well, let's start with you. Because we've touched base 2019. Was it 2018 we first exchanged emails? It was around about that period anyway.
Yeah, 2019. Yeah.
And I've loved listening to your podcast grow in popularity. And I wished if your podcast had existed when I was deconstructing, it would have been an enormous help for me. So I think what your podcast does, what the Graceful Atheist podcast does, is immensely valuable, and I hope it never goes away. Yes, I've heard you say it as well. And yes, not everybody wants to listen to a new deconversion story every week.
Yeah.
For some people, there's a period of time in which it's really helpful. And then they move on. And I've seen this in the community. Some people come and then they go. They've shed their burden. They don't want to dwell in it anymore, and they need to move on.
Yeah, I describe it as either aging out or maturing out.
Yes.
Yeah, it's no longer necessary for that person.
Let me make it personal for a bit. I'm the eldest of 3 brothers. We all grew up in the same environment. We all suffered the same traumatic divorce of our parents in Zambia. We're all very familiar with the Zambian missionary environment. Listeners, you're going to have to listen to my original episode where I give more context to this. But my 2 brothers do not talk daily about their past Christian faith. It's not relevant to them. It's not important to them. I even talked with my youngest brother. I'm actually going up to see him tomorrow morning to spend a couple of days with him, helping out with his house. I'm really looking forward, to a long weekend with him. Brothers, we bond. I'm really looking forward to that time with him.
Yeah.
But I did say to him one day, I said, maybe you and I could do a good episode on Unbelievable, talk about our experiences. I'm sure it would be appreciated. And he said, you know what? Nah, not interested.
Yeah.
Do nothing. And for some people, that's fine. I'm not going to raise the subject again. We've had that conversation. Fine. It's pointless me pushing it. And because all I'll do is force him to rethink things that he doesn't care to think about. We've got better brotherly things to talk about, which we'll both appreciate. And that's perfectly fine. Let's just lay that out there. Once you come in and you join this community, you're not bound to it. There are no pointy fingers if you decide that it's not for you anymore. We're not going to condemn you to atheist hell for eternal torture because you feel that this isn't serving you anymore. So for some people, the service that our content provides is temporary. But for other people, they want to hang around. And for those that hang around, there can be a new role. And the role is holding hands with the newcomers, because there's always people coming in. And that's the one thing I've noticed is being part of these deconstruction groups and watching your podcast specifically grow. I'm not going to hint about any kind of jealousy about your podcast becoming really, really popular. I'm not going to say it through any kind of gritted teeth whatsoever, but I'm really glad that your stories, and there are others as well, I can't remember, Tales of Deconversion, is that what it's called, or something like that?
Voices of Deconversion, yeah. So which Steve Hilliker, I give him a lot of credit for. I'm basically ripping him off and doing what he did. So, but yeah.
And it's a necessary thing, and it's nice to see people getting something new out of every episode, and it's nice to see people hang around to help those. But
yes,
can you imagine how busy this space would be if every single deconverter hung around to welcome in all the new ones? It will become crowded and it will become untenable. Yeah. It's perfectly appropriate for those, they've sorted out their deconstruction grief. They've got to a comfortable place with any trauma that they carry. It's time for them to move on because it's no longer good for them. Move on.
Yeah.
It is. There are plenty of people around. I think that's why I hang around, because I've seen a lot of pain. I've experienced a lot of pain. And even now, I still learn about things which shock me and surprise me. So I still want to be around to be a voice for others. And every now and then I'll see somebody will ask a question in one of the deconstruction posts, and I'll see some of the replies there, and I'll add on saying, yeah, so and so is right, that's really good advice, or something. Like, you guys have just had the most religious holiday in the United States, your Thanksgiving weekend, and tongue in cheek somewhat.
Yes.
But what happens when I notice it when Thanksgiving comes up is the deconstruction groups always say, there will be somebody who'll say, help, I've got a parent coming around for the weekend.
Yes.
There's going to be this, there's going to be that. How do I handle this? I need something, etc. That's going to happen every single year. And there'll be somebody new every single year with that trauma, with that panic. And it needs people to hang around, to go, yeah, I've been there, or your home, your rules. You know, you're perfectly entitled to say to the parent, this is my house. You're an adult now. Because some people have a complex relationship with their parents. I've still got, I mentioned it in our discussion, I've still got a complex relationship with my father. I came out to my dad, 8 years ago now, I think it was, as atheist in the conversation. I didn't intend to, but the conversation went into a particular direction, and I just went, no, we're not going there. I'm atheist now. That's not happening. And he's not spoken to me about that particular subject again. But I've heard from my brother that he wants to talk me out of my atheism.
Right.
And my brother just said, don't. Just don't do it. You know, that will not end well. Do not have that conversation with Matthew. And my brother was a barrier there. But you see, he had that conversation with my brother because he couldn't have it with me. And so even me, and I'm a very confident atheist, I can stand my ground, and I will stand my ground if I need to, even to the overbearing parent. I just won't hold back, and I will do it. Not everybody has got that confidence. Not everybody is secure to be able to do that. And so they need these forums, and they need these groups to say, help, has anyone been in this situation? And half a dozen people will go, yes, and they'll give their experiences. Yeah. So we need those people to hang around and to pass on the advice. And for those who feel comfortable hanging around post deconversion to be as part of the hand-holding crowd, God bless you, people. You are wonderful. You are, did I just say God bless?
You did.
Unicorn bless you, wonderful people. You know, you are an asset to this community. You know, I did do that on purpose, obviously, David. But,
So another thing that we share that's definitely not unique, but is interesting, is that we have believing wives.
Yes. How did that happen, David? You couldn't invent that. It was quite peculiar to find out that we had that in common. And I'm wondering what it is about the spouse of a believer that they end up in doing this, what we're doing. Isn't that scenario motivation to not do this?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. Let me address that question in just a second. I want you to talk about your wife and whatever generics or specifics that you want to get into. But my wife is a deep believer, right? If she never put foot in a church again for the rest of her life, she's probably still going to be a believer, right? It's internal for her on a super deep level. And I respect her faith, even though I think she's mistaken, right?
Yeah.
So like, I want to convey, like, it is about as opposite as you could be.
Yes.
The one thing that we do have going for us is, I think politically we're more aligned, and the two of us really care about people.
Yeah.
And we both do in our various different ways, try to help people. And I think it's that shared values that has enabled us to get through what was a pretty rocky period of time going through this transition when I said I no longer believed. In regards to what makes somebody motivated for this, I think it's in spite of that. Like, my biggest concern when I started was I didn't want to hurt my wife. I didn't want her to feel attacked or abused. And yet I had to talk about this stuff. I had to, because it was killing me.
Yes.
And so, we've come to an uneasy detente, right? I can't say that she's happy about it, but she accepts that this is something that I do, right?
Yeah.
So I'm curious what your experience has been.
My wife would probably echo exactly the same things that you've said about your own. So we are very much aligned. And yes, it would kill me not to shut up. I am very much a dog with a bone kind of personality. I wouldn't say that I was necessarily intellectual, but I like intellectual challenge. I like consuming scientific content, and I like discourse, and I like challenge, and doing Still Unbelievable and doing it with Andrew fulfills so much of that, and I love it. And I love listening to the other various atheist and some Christian podcasts as well. I really enjoy consuming that content as well as creating it. But all the things you said, yes, it's uncomfortable as well. And my deconstruction was marred with fear. I genuinely believed that my deconversion, at the point when I got to the point where I was fairly sure it was inevitable, I genuinely believed that would spell the end to a marriage that I didn't want to end. And
Yes.
that, despite everything else, ignoring everything else, that little snippet in on itself is traumatizing and fear-inducing and even paralyzing.
Yeah.
And when you go and read blog after blog after blog of somebody in the same situation, and every single one of them is the marriages have failed. The attrition rate of marriages in this space is frighteningly high. You and I have gone against the odds. Let's be open and honest about that.
Yeah.
And yes, part of it is my wife and I are politically aligned. Our politics has shifted over the last 20 years and has shifted in the same direction. We are very much aligned on an awful lot of things. And my wife's job is for a charity here in this part of the UK, which coordinates mentoring. So adults mentoring, usually teenagers, who are in a problematic scenario, and helping those teenagers to develop and foster a mature relationship with an adult, somebody they can confide in, who they can trust, who can give them adult advice, who has got the backing of professionals if there should be anything problematic. And she finds that immensely fulfilling. And we talk about that. She tells me about her job an awful lot, and I'm interested in her job. I'm interested in the technicalities and the things that are achieved in that job. And off the back of doing that job, she's done 1 degree in child psychology, and she's just started her second. And that is massively fulfilling for her. And we are both on the same page with regards to the need for that. And I'm quite happy with whatever way I can to support her in doing that. So there is much for us to celebrate together. We don't. She might disagree, but we don't, inverted commas, need Christianity in order to create a successful marriage. And I think that's why we've managed. It's not been easy. It's not been smooth sailing. And in the past 10 years, I'm obviously not going to go detail on any specifics. I'm obviously not going to say anything about my wife that I might later regret. But the conversation of separation did come up at some point during there, and we did talk it through. And it didn't progress very far. We decided it was really nothing that either of us particularly wanted to stomach. Neither of us was in a mindset where it was something we wanted to seriously progress. And so it just really didn't go anywhere. It was a very short conversation, not to be brought up again. So listeners, please don't read too much into. I've probably talked more about this than we actually talked about it.
I understood.
don't read too much into that. But I would like to say that for the Christian spouse of somebody who leaves, life can be hard. Life can be difficult. I remember as a 20-something-year-old going to church and knowing women at church whose husbands weren't believers. And they would come to church and they would come to church events and the husband was never there. And I remember pitying those women. And there is no better description of the patronizing attitude we took to those women and to pity them. Why couldn't we treat them as individuals of their own right? They don't exist for their husband to be there with them. They are a person, they're an individual in their own right. Why couldn't we have treated them as persons and individuals in their own right? Why did we look at them as if they were incomplete because their husband wasn't coming to church? What a shocking way to look at these women. But my experience, my decision, for lack of a better word, although we could talk about that, it wasn't a decision, but let's just call it a decision for the time being. My decision has forced my wife into that scenario,
right?
And she doesn't enjoy it. Let's be honest about that. She has responsibilities in church. She occasionally preaches at church, but she is that woman at church without a spouse. And if people in the church pair up in couples to go out and socialize, she suddenly finds that she's intentionally or otherwise excluded, possibly because she's overlooked. Or if there'll be a conversation with somebody, and it's happened on more than one occasion, she'll be talking with somebody at church who's relatively new, and they'll have seen Sarah up at the front of the church, either preaching or doing some other part of the service. And they'll say to her, "Is there a Mr. Taylor?" Yeah, and then she has to go, "Oh, now what answer do I give now? Is this somebody? Right. How much detail is safe to give to this individual? And it creates a hell in church for those spouses. It's not pleasant for them. But I can't set foot in a church on a weekly basis. It's not something that's pleasant for me. I've got other things I'd rather be doing. I'm usually editing a podcast when she's at church on a Sunday morning, and so it creates this this inner conflict within each of us. I know that I've condemned her to this, and she knows that sometimes she'll have a less than pleasant experience at church purely because there isn't a man by her side. And for many, many spouses of a deconverted person, this is the hell of going to church. And I don't have an answer to that particular problem. Maybe it's not mine to solve. Maybe it's churches need to find a way to solve that. So, sometimes in the deconstruction space, we can talk about us and our trauma of deconversion and our fear of leaving. But there are casualties that we cause as part of that journey as well. It's not our fault. I want to be very quick on that. Right. It isn't our fault that there are casualties, and those people are wrong to blame us for what's happened. But that is sometimes how they feel, and that is the side effect of that. And we need to have compassion for those Christians in our lives. And Sarah and I are still navigating that. Incidentally, I need to say this. I went onto the Graceful Atheist YouTube channel, and because I was on it in 2019, and then my wife in the beginning of 2020, she's got more than 3 times the number of views of her YouTube video than me. There's something. This is not a good place to be if you've got an ego. Let's just put it that way.
We are quite entangled. So I did interview your wife. I thought that was a really good conversation. I felt that she was really courageous to come onto the podcast. That was a brave thing to do. And then my wife listened to your wife's episode. It's maybe the only episode she's listened to. And then I had my wife on in, I think it was late 2020. I don't think she'll ever do it again.
Yeah.
But it was interesting, like that interaction, her hearing Sarah's story was part of that.
Yeah, I would love to have a conversation with a spouse of a believing spouse of a deconverted person. It doesn't have to be your wife, but if you or any listener has any contacts to a believing partner who would love to, I would love to flesh out the things that I've just been talking about the experience of the Christian. I think Sarah is very much of the same mindset as your wife. It's I'm too close. I'm too personal. It would be inappropriate for me to even ask Sarah to have that conversation with me live on air. This is something that's personal between us. I would never ask, and I wouldn't. I probably wouldn't even want it if I'm honest. But if somebody does have a believing spouse, gender is unimportant. to talk through this kind of experience, to see how they judge what I've just said and how we navigate this kind of thing, because it's a difficult situation, and so many people come into these deconversion groups with a believing partner, and some of the stories have genuinely moved me to tears. Marriages disintegrating in deeply unpleasant tones, and it's horrific to read and watch. That pain that must happen, it touches the fears that I had 10 plus years ago. And
right.
those experiences are still very real for people, and those people, we need to work out a way to love people through that particular trauma, because it's got to be the worst part of this kind of experience.
Yeah, I would be interested in talking to more spouses as well, or partners of any kind, but to hear their perspective also.
Maybe we could probably do it as a duo, actually, David. I think that would probably work really well. You could be my Andrew for a day, and I'm sure we would have a very pleasant. So this is a genuine request to people listening to this. If you know somebody who could be there, please get in touch with David via all the contact details that he gives on his show. I think it'll be a genuinely worthwhile conversation.
Matthew, I think we could keep talking for a long time, but I actually want to end on this note because I think what we've just talked about was just really important. But I do want to give you a moment to, again, plug your podcast, and how can people get in touch with you?
Wow. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so Still Unbelievable is where to find me. Any other podcast associated with my name is probably unsafe to search for, because it might not exist anymore. So search Still Unbelievable or reasonpress.net. Matthew Taylor is a depressingly common name, so try not to search Matthew Taylor on the internet. You'll find all sorts of other people. I had a very strange experience listening to one podcast. I think it was a New Evangelicals podcast, and he introduced a guest, Dr. Matthew Taylor, talking about something to do with deconversion. I went, hang on a minute, who's this? Okay, yes. It's not me from an alternate universe. I certainly don't have a doctorate. So that's the best place, or reasonpress@gmail.com is the email address to use, or friendly mail or hate mail if necessary. You can contact me using that way. I love being in this space. I love having feedback. I love having the conversations with people. So I listen to a ridiculous number of various podcasts of all stripes and things to create the content that I do for Still Unbelievable.
Thank you, Matthew, for being back on the podcast. It was amazing to get back in touch. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Final thoughts on the episode. As Matthew points out, Still Unbelievable and the work that he has done has really been an anti-apologetics perspective. He calls himself spiky. But one of the things I loved about re-listening to our conversation from 2019 and this conversation is just how much Matthew cares about people, and that just comes out. And in particular, people who are in the middle of the deconstruction process, and the empathy that he has for that process, having gone through it himself. One of the most important topics that we discussed is being married to believers and how much we respect our spouses. I know that many of you are in unequally yoked relationships in one form or another, and that is a very, very difficult topic. A shout out again to Matthew's wife, Sarah, who did come on the podcast. That was amazing. My wife, who came on the podcast as well, even though I know that was incredibly difficult. I want to thank Matthew for being on the podcast on this 200th podcast. I really appreciate Matthew's perspective, and he has been a fantastic friend. Thank you so much, Matthew. For the Secular Grace thought of the podcast, it is about humanism. This podcast has been from day one about humanism. Being human, embracing our own humanity, embracing the humanity of others. And part of that is recognizing my personal humanity. As I mentioned a few months back, between work and family life, all of these are good things, I've had less and less time for the podcast. So it is time for a break. That break will be for an indeterminate amount of time. I'm not sure how long, but I know that I'll come back to this. I know that this is not the end. This is not goodbye. This is until we hear each other next time. I have loved doing this podcast. We've done it for almost 5 years now. As we mentioned earlier, the 200th episode. Could not have done it without Mike T doing all the editing, without Arlene doing interviews, managing the community, and 1,000 other things. And most of all, has been amazing talking to you. As I said in my conversation with Matthew, I started this for selfish reasons. I needed to talk about it myself, and I just hoped that somebody else might be interested. And I cannot believe to this day how many of you have listened over the years. And also, as we mentioned in the conversation, how many of you have grown out of it. That's fantastic. That's a best case scenario. And I'm really, really grateful for all of that. So I have some ideas about when I come back. I want to reset just a bit back to a focus on humanism. I'll talk about this more in the next episode, which again, indeterminate amount of time when that will be. I also believe that the podcast will go into seasons rather than being year-long, doing maybe 3-month sessions, spring and fall, something like that. Something that's maintainable and not quite as exhausting. But I have a number of ideas for future episodes already, kind of planning those in my head. And when I feel invigorated again to do them, you will hear them here. For those of you who are Patreon supporters, again, I 100% give you the freedom to cancel that support. I cannot promise how often episodes will come out going forward. And those were not the original terms in which you began supporting the podcast. If you do stick around, if you do decide that you'd like to continue to support the podcast, that's fantastic. I will use that. We'll continue to do the Zoom for the community, as well as future production value for the podcast itself. As a year end to 2023 and the hiatus and break for the podcast, I just want to say thank you to you, the listeners, for being here, participating, being a part of the community. That is why I podcast. Until next time, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. The beat is called Waves by Mackay Beats. If you want to get in touch with me to be a guest on the show, email me at gracefulatheist@gmail.com. For blog posts, quotes, recommendations, and full episode transcripts, head over to gracefulatheist.com. This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast, a part of the Atheist United Studios Podcast Network.